Today's lecture is going to be about the four lobes that make up our cerebral cortex. We're going to explain the functions of the motor cortex, the somatosensory cortex, and the association areas. We're also going to analyze that we really only use 10% of our brain. We're going to discuss how the brain adjusts to new experiences. And we're going to discuss the ability to recognize itself after a damage and explain neurogenesis. What is the cerebral cortex? This is a neural network in the cerebral cortex that makes up about 85% of our brain's weight. This governs our perceptions, our thinking, speaking. It covers the older part of the brain structures, protecting the basic life functions. Within the cerebral cortex, there are 20 plus billion nerve cells. That makes 300 trillion synaptic connections. Only a third of our cerebral cortex is visible from the surface. Our cerebral cortex is strongly linked to our intelligence. These wrinkles, called fissures, support billions of nerve cells, which we refer to as glial cells. You may remember me talking about glial cells when we talked about the neurons. The glial cells are worker bees. They provide nutrients that insulate the myelin sheath. And if you remember the myelin sheath, what it does, it ensures the speed in which the neuron can communicate along the axon. The cerebral cortex is divided into what we call lobes. Each hemisphere, half of our brain, has four regions called lobes. The frontal lobe is responsible for foreseeing consequences, how we perceive our goals, and our emotional control. The parietal lobe is behind the motor cortex. This receives information from our bottom half of the body. The temporal lobes receives auditory information. And if you guys remember, all the information that we receive from, for example, our ears is sent to the opposite ear or opposite temporal lobe. The occipital lobes, we talked about yesterday, receives visual information. The motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. We talked a little bit about these before as we look at controlling our voluntary movement, registering information from our senses, and so on. There was a study done by Frisch and Hitzig about the motor cortex. By stimulating parts of the brain, the different hemispheres cause movements in specific parts of the body on the opposite side. And this shows our basic functions and also how our body communicates to the brain. The motor cortex sends messages out to the body. The sensory cortex receives messages from our body. So the more sensitive areas of our body are devoted to the sensory cortex. The auditory cortex receives information, and our visual cortex receives information from our eyes. Do we really only use 10% of our brain? By doing scans and so forth, we have these what are called association areas. And one of the hardest things that we can possibly do is that understanding the capacity of our brain. We also know that because people are able to overcome serious brain injuries, that tells us that there's a lot of part of our brain that is not being used. So let's talk a little bit about association areas. What are they? This is where neurons integrate information. They link our sensory inputs with our stored memories. And these association areas are found on all four of our lobal regions. So as information through our senses come in, what happens is our associations areas take that information and they make connections with things that we already know in our memory. So we understand and don't have to process everything as new all the time. The important thing is the association areas, if you can see in this slide, are responsible for high-level functions, specifically where our planning occurs. It enables us to judge, plan, process new memories. For example, in the association areas in the parietal lobe enable mathematic and spatial reasoning. And I said before, Albert Einstein, one of the things that they found in his brain is in the parietal lobe. This is what is usually larger for him than it was for the normal person. We've talked about Phineas Gage and referenced him a couple times. Here is a slide that shows a little bit about Phineas Gage, and you can see where this metal rod went through his head, and this tamping. This is referred to as an aphasia, an impairment of language that is caused by damage to either the Broca or the Wernicke areas, which we'll talk about here in a second. But as this tamping rod went through his brain, it severed his frontal lobe from his amygdala. And so what happens with him is that he is unable to judge and control his emotions, and he acts upon his amygdala. So the Broca area and the Wernicke area have a lot to do with our communication. The Broca area is our language center in our left frontal lobe. It is involved in our expression of language. The Wernicke area is our language center located in our temporal lobe, which is involved in receptive language. So what does that mean? Okay, so as we talk about aphasias, if there is damage in the Broca or Wernicke areas, we could possibly speak fluently but not be able to read. We could comprehend but not be able to speak. We could write but not be able to read but not be able to write, or read numbers but not letters. So what happens as the Broca and Wernicke areas are being used is we read, and that is sent to our visual cortex. From there, it's sent to the angular gyrus, where it is encoded into an auditory form. The Wernicke area takes that and derives its meaning, then sends it to the Broca area, which controls the motor cortex, creating a pronounced word. So how do we see this in action? Well, if you guys remember when we talked about our brain imaging techniques, an fMRI would show exactly this process, going from reading, sending it to the visual cortex, all the way to be in the Broca area telling us what to actually say. The brain's resilient ways to compensate for an injury. Most younger people are able to regain a lot of their capacity, but the older we get, we struggle possibly. The brain is sculpted by our genetics and our experiences. And one of the things that happens is our brain has the ability to change and reorganize after a damage. And what happens is it builds new pathways and is based on those experiences. And that enables our brain to have what is called plasticity. Now, tomorrow you're going to be watching a video which will show plasticity of a young girl who has brain damage and has a hemispherectomy. And that will, I guarantee, amaze you. Remember we talked about the London taxi drivers? This is, again, this plasticity in reference here. So how does it work? Practicing music, for example, thickens the brain. That does our executive functioning, our working memory, our attention control, and organizing and planning. So in this case, this young girl who has had seizures, she was able to have this hemispherectomy. And so what happens is our brain begins to adapt and change so that this girl can function. And it is good news, for example, for people who are blind and deaf, because those unused areas are available to other parts of the brain that is being used. It enhances our preferential vision for deaf people, for example. So people who are deaf visually are more acute, and so on. So what is neurogenesis? Contrary to the long belief, we can generate new brain cells. What are those ways in which we can generate new brain cells? This is the self-repairment of existing tissue. Our brain tends to mend itself, producing new neurons. So how do we do that? How can we produce naturally neurogenesis? We can do through exercise, by getting the sleep that we need. If we're in environments that are non-stressful, but also are stimulating. So think about that, for example, are you exercising? Are you getting the sleep that you need? Are you putting yourself in stimulating environments that don't stress you? If you do, what you're creating is neurogenesis. This will end our discussion today about the brain and neurogenesis, and we'll see you tomorrow.